All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Insurance Know-How for Your Staff, hosted by California Association of Museums. My name is Rochelle. I'm the programs manager for CAM. And we have this awesome program today put on by Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services and Great American Insurance Group. Um, Before we begin this event, CAM, we just want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. California is home to over 150 tribes, and an acknowledgement is just one step towards working with Native communities in meaningful relationships. Museums and many institutions were founded upon purposeful exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and still benefit from settler colonialism and associated harms. CAM is committed to moving beyond land acknowledgements and people acknowledgements and into action. And we encourage you and your organizations to find out more about the tribes in your areas and find ways to celebrate and support them. So I'm in North Hollywood, California, which is the traditional territory of the Chumash, Gabrielino Tongva, and the Tataviam peoples. Um, I'll put a link in the chat, excuse me, of a helpful but not definitive resource to learn more about the tribes in your areas. You might be familiar with it. So I'll put that in the chat in a moment. But let me get into a little bit of housekeeping and I'll kind of kick off the session and introduce our speakers today. This webinar is being recorded. We'll post the link to CAM's YouTube page. Registrants will receive the link via email once that has been uploaded, so you'll be able to access it at any point. The chat will be open throughout the session. I think I updated the access, so if it's not working, you can send me a message if you're having any trouble with kind of tech. The Q&A function will also be open throughout. You'll be able to send questions to the panelists. Questions will most likely be answered at the end, but if they're particularly relevant to anything that's being discussed in that moment, then I may interject and present that question to Chelsea and Cole. Any resources and links that are kind of mentioned in here, I'm happy to share with registrants after the after the webinar as well, once I share the recording link to the YouTube video. Okay. All right. So again, we are here for Insurance Know-How for Your Staff by Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services and Great American Insurance Group. This is just a little legal disclaimer. So I will leave this up here briefly. All right. And our presenters today, we have Cole Kinney from Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services and Chelsea Wood from Great American Insurance Company. And we've been working on getting this presentation out for a while, and we're really excited that we are able to kind of have this session today. Today's agenda will be just sort of an introduction. Chelsea and Cole will discuss common coverages, claim examples, discuss risk management, and Q&A portion as well. So we have lots of questions ready to go. I will pass it over to Chelsea and Cole, and I will be off camera and muted. But again, please use the chat or the Q&A or message me directly if you have any questions or need support.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. It's good to have all you all here today. Thank you for coming. My name's Cole. I'm from Cal Nonprofits. We're the social enterprise of the California Association of Nonprofits. And we created this program actually right before the pandemic and the shutdown. And then it kind of all went away when you all had to shut down. So this is a really great program. We feel we partnered with Great American and some other insurance companies to basically provide exclusive rates to anyone that's a CAM member. And we're going to kind of go over what the program is and what kinds of coverages are offered and just help you understand what's available. Again, feel free to answer or ask any questions along the way. We're happy to address those. So next slide. So we're going to talk about the common insurance coverages, which are general liability, abuse liability, professional liability, auto liability, property, directors and officers, and employment practices liability. So essentially, we're just going to talk about how all these coverages apply to your type of organization. In many cases, if you lease a building, you're required to have certain coverages like general liability. If you work with local schools or anyone that's a minor, Abuse liability is also recommended or required in some cases. Professional liability, if you provide any professional services, or if you're just working as like a social service organization providing social services. Auto liability, even if you don't own vehicles, auto liability is also recommended because you may have what's called a non-owned or rented exposure. They also call it hired auto liability. So people using their own vehicles or renting vehicles on your behalf. And then property would basically be able to insure all of the things you own or lease, including buildings, personal property, your fine arts, all those things there. And then directors and officers liability and employment practices liability, those are usually linked together in one policy to basically make sure that your board members are protected against any decisions they make, things like that. And then the employment related liability noted is for things like wrongful termination, discrimination, things like that. So next slide. So some other coverages are things like crime, bonding. So crime would be things like employee dishonesty, forgery. Bonding would be anything that you're required to have a bond for. So things like an ERISA bond, if you have a sponsored retirement plan, or if you're required to hold some sort of bond related to some sort of contract or something like that. Cyber liability is also a really common coverage we see now, and one that we're strongly recommending. It basically covers you for the costs associated with a breach. So if someone was to breach your server due to, for example, someone clicking on a bad link to let the bad guys in, it covers you for things like the forensic experts to come in and see how the bad guys got in, what kind of damage they've done, if they're still in, things like that. It would pay for all the notices that have to go out if any protected information was exposed. So that's a HIPAA requirement. It would also pay for any business interruption. Things like cyber crime would also be covered in that policy form as well, where things like funds transfer fraud, social engineering, or fraudulent impersonation. So like common claims on that would be somebody asking you for, basically trying to just show that there's someone from your organization asking for you to send them gift cards from Amazon or something like that, and just giving them the numbers for that. That's a really common thing. Or even someone hacking a personal email of one of your employees and asking for you to change their bank account for direct deposits. So those are really common things in cyber. We're also seeing cyber being requested quite a bit in contracts. So that's another big issue, to a reason to have the coverage. Active assailant is basically coverage in the event that someone was to come onto your premise with a weapon or came in and did harm in that manner. The policy form that we have automatically builds that in at no extra cost for certain sublimits. Unfortunately, that's a coverage we have to all live with today, and it's great that it's readily available. Volunteer accident would be for all the docents that you work with. It's really nice that you have those folks working with you. I'm sure you wouldn't be able to operate your museums without that. It would also include board members or anyone that's sort of maybe working with you all related to some sort of event or any ongoing museum operations. That kind of policy would provide coverage for them if they got hurt or worse, died or anything during the time that they were volunteering for you. And then workers' compensation is basically for any paid staff member. In some cases, we can include volunteers under workers' compensation. We normally recommend that you don't do that you have them separately set up through a separate volunteer accident policy. The main differences there would be that under workers' compensation, if someone gets hurt on the job, they're not only going to be covered for all their medical benefits, but time off work, disability income payments because they weren't able to work, things like that. So the volunteer policy wouldn't cover things like disability income and things like that. It can, if you'd like to look into that, we can address that. So if somebody was hurt and they weren't able to do their regular job, if they were a volunteer, those kind of policies can address that exposure as well. Workers' compensation also pays for things like permanent disability or rehabilitation benefits if they couldn't go back to the normal job. So it's a little different. Plus, the overall benefits for workers' compensation are larger. Usually on the volunteer accident, the limits for the different coverages like medical expense and death, dismemberment, all these kind of different claim benefits under that policy would be limited at a certain amount, like maybe 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, something like that. Whereas workers' compensation benefits for any kind of medical would be unlimited. Next slide. So claims examples, I'm going to let Chelsea talk about some of these. She really is the expert on this. She's a risk manager with Great American Insurance. So Chelsea, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Cole. So I'm going to share some of the claim examples that we might see come in on our side. So the first one I wanted to share is an example of an inland marine, would fall under an inland marine coverage form, which is usually part of your property coverage. So an example we've seen with a museum or might see at some point would be like during an off-premises exhibit, maybe a museum employee locked several valuable relics overnight in a truck. And then when the employee returned, the relics were missing. So after authorities had determined that the items were in fact stolen, the museum felt some comfort in knowing that their valuables were properly appraised and they were protected under an inland marine insurance coverage. Another example I wanted to share would be a common one under property. So once we had on the morning, a manager of a museum came in early to find that their front sign had been vandalized. She quickly checked her policy and had remembered seeing that, via maybe some endorsements or some particular property coverage, that they had coverage for signs. And that included vandalism type damage to the signs, so that was covered. Another example of one we've seen is due to third-party special event hosting. So something to be aware of when you have maybe vendors at a special event. So a museum had decided to rent out some space for a special event, and during the event, someone spilled a beverage on the floor, leaving the ground slick. And unfortunately, someone tripped and fell on that wet surface and suffered several injuries. And so later there was a claim filed, and fortunately there was a contract in place with the renter that required the museum to be named as an additional insured. And there's different provisions you can put on the additional insured coverage as well. So the claims team was able to tender defense and indemnity, and the museum was covered. So those are some examples that we've seen or may see on our side of things. I'll turn it back to Cole.
Yeah, thank you. So basically the common claims, like Chelsea was saying, would be related to either things that are like a break-in where things were stolen, whether they be things that are owned or leased by you, or relics, like she mentioned, fine arts. And those fine arts can be things that belong to you or on loan from others. The big thing that she touched on was contract management. So like the event that she mentioned where somebody was renting space from the museum, which is pretty common. We really like for you all to have what's called a facilities use agreement in place. And that's basically going to spell out the responsibilities that you have, what the renter has, and then it usually includes certain wording in there that we call indemnification. And so indemnification means that someone's going to put you back in the same place you were prior to the claim or the loss. And so it usually includes wording like they're going to hold you harmless and indemnify you against any accident that happens. But you also want to have something in there related to insurance and specific types of insurance. So like general liability is basically bodily injury or property damage to a third party. So in the example Chelsea gave, where someone's at this event, it's being catered maybe by another third party of that organization that rented the facility. So everybody needs to have insurance. So the caterer that's serving alcohol or serving food, the organization that's renting the space, all that should be basically set up through these contracts, that everyone should be having in place for everyone else. So in the event that there's a claim, the person responsible for the claim should be held responsible. So their own insurance policy should respond. And then this additional insured wording that Chelsea mentioned basically says that in the example like she gave where somebody tripped and fell, what can happen is that the museum could be named in a lawsuit as well as that organization that was renting the space. And so if that additional insured wording's in place, that will give your museum the ability to be insured under the renter's policy for your cost of defense, as well as any damages you'd incur because of the loss that they incurred. Okay, hope that makes sense. So essentially, you're renting out the space. They have to provide their own insurance, provide proof to you that they have insurance, and they also want to have that additional insured wording in place that can only be done if you have it written in a contract. So that additional insured wording should be stated specifically in that facility's use agreement. So the other example is if you're hosting an event and you said that you wanted to get like a caterer to provide the food and serve alcohol or whatever beverages, you'd want to do the same thing. So you want to have a agreement in place with that caterer that requires that they provide you proof of insurance and that additional insured wording for liability. And you also want to ask them to provide you coverage for liquor liability, because that's a separate coverage in addition to general liability. Because if someone was to drink too much alcohol and then leave and drive away and have a terrible accident where there's people injured or worse, there could be a lawsuit from that, and they could name the museum as well as whoever was serving them, all that. So you basically want to make sure that there's both general liability and liquor liability in that agreement, with the additional insured applying to both coverages. I think that's pretty much the main thing, but contract management is a big deal in your world. I've worked with lots of different museums over the years. I remember there was one with, I'm here in San Francisco, and I was working with an organization that was going to be having an exhibit out at Alcatraz, and they had contracted with this really wonderful artist in China, Ai Weiwei, if you've ever heard of him, and they were going to have this really amazing exhibit, huge exhibit out at Alcatraz. And it was all to basically highlight the issue around, political prisoners and stuff around the world. And so all this artwork was done in China and then shipped. And so they worked with a curator here in San Francisco to handle all the shipment. And then they basically set up and worked with different independent contractors to do all the work and a setup of the venue. And so we had to review all those contracts to see who's insuring the goods coming from China to California. How are the goods going to be shipped from California to the venue, which was Alcatraz? And then who was going to be insuring all the different people that were responsible for setting that up and then shipping it back. And so that whole thing around contract management is a big deal. And so it's really important that you review those agreements. The other things that comes into play is also you all loaning fine arts and then receiving loan fine arts. So make sure that you have good agreements there. Who's responsible for shipping it, ensuring the shipment back and forth, who's responsible for the insurance while it's being displayed, all that. Next slide. On the cyber liability, we talked about a few examples that could happen from a cyber case, but the number one reason that we're seeing cyber claims is due to an employee or a volunteer clicking on a bad link. That's the number one thing. So training for your staff, which we can get into on the risk management side, is really the most critical thing. Like our organization has a company that we contract with where basically our compliance officer sends out these random emails throughout the month that look legit. And if anyone clicks on the link inside that email, they have to take a 20-minute cyber refresher course. So once you do that once, like I did, you are really careful. So you really look closely at the email address, make sure you hover over it to see that it's really from that person. And sometimes you can just look at the email and say, that's just not a legitimate email. It doesn't look right, the format or whatever. But really make sure you can hover over the link to see that it's a legitimate link. And don't click on it unless you really believe that it's a legitimate email. Directors and officers liability, including employment practices liability. The most common claims on that would be all related to employment practices liability. So directors and officers liability is essentially liability for board governance. So a lot of times you'll see board members be really concerned about having super high limits on this coverage. The high limits that you really want to see for liability would be on the actual museum itself. Because the museum would have say an exposure to general liability, which would be slip and fall, or all the examples we talked about under general liability. And you'd want to have strong limits there because there's very, very few claims that we see related to true directors and officers liability. So the board is going to be considered an insured under every one of these policies that we're talking about. So the general liability, auto liability, cyber liability, all those. The definition of insured would include your museum, its employees, volunteers, including board. And then under the D&O policy or directors and officers coverage, that policy also can also extend to committees of the board, subcommittees of the board, like if you had an audit committee, things like that. Okay. And then employment practices liability, that covers claims for things like wrongful termination, discrimination, harassment. Those sorts of claims can come from an employee or even a third party you contract with. Okay, that policy form can also pick up something called fiduciary liability. And so you act as a fiduciary on behalf of employees when you place benefits for them, like group health or even a sponsored retirement plan. Even though you use a third party to do that, you could still be named in a lawsuit. So fiduciary liability is something that those kind of policies can add at a very low cost. The volunteer accident, pretty self-descriptive there, but we do see claims fairly often in this area where a docent gets hurt, slips and falls. It's a really nice benefit to provide them. It's not usually state mandated or mandated by any contract, but it is a good thing for you guys to have that in place. And then of course, workers' compensation is a mandated coverage that everyone should have. The program we have has special discounted rates just for CAM members. Next slide. So we're going to tell you now how to avoid even using the insurance. It's essentially what risk management is. So there's all kinds of ways to avoid. We're going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty things, and we can show the next slide, and then Chelsea can get into these details because she's really the expert on this. Go ahead, Chelsea.
All right, I'll talk about some of these, and Cole, I think you were going to touch on some of these as well. So the use of participant waivers is incredibly important, and Cole has already talked about this, but one of the benefits of working with your agency and carrier is that we are a good resource to helping provide some of these things so that you can quickly create your waivers, take them to your legal team for review. So one of the things that we offer at Great American is a waiver template builder. So you can actually, when you're insured with us, you can actually go online. There's a template that you can start from, so you don't have to start from scratch or use Google. So it comes with a template specifically designed actually for nonprofit organizations. And you go through and you build your waivers. This can be a consent waiver. It can also be a risk transfer, vendor management type waiver that you might have. So different, and then it prints it out in a Word doc form so that you can further tailor it and send it through your legal team for review. So that's just one of the many benefits of being with a carrier that offer or specializes in nonprofit type insurance. One of the other, and actually, Cole, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you for some of these other items that I think you had some special talking points for.
Yeah, so we kind of hit on the third-party contract reviews.
Yeah.
We review those kinds of contracts all the time. It could be a lease, or they could be whatever we talked about earlier about loaning art or anything like that. It's really good to review those with your insurance broker before you sign them, because a lot of times there may be insurance clauses in there that really aren't appropriate for what the exposure is, or that you don't have the insurance for. So it's really good to review those with your broker prior to entering into that agreement. We do those all the time. We're not we're not attorneys. We are just insurance brokers, but we are used to looking at contracts because a lot of those are required for us to be able to issue certificates of insurance, things like that. And then use of contract, space contracts like facility use agreements, things like that. Events we talked about. EPLI hotline stands for Employment Practices Liability Hotlines. Companies like Great American and other insurance companies that write directors and officers liability provide complimentary services for you to help avoid employment practices related liability claims, things like wrongful termination, discrimination, things like that, by using in-house people or third-party attorneys to basically answer really important questions on how to go about with pre-termination, legal advice, things like that. So it's a really great service, basically to help you avoid those kinds of claims. And then workers' compensation companies also provide complimentary safety training. So a lot of that could be based on their website, like Chelsea was referring to, where you can go in and see all the resources that are available. There could be like some kind of online learning course, or they could even send people out to your facility to do some sort of training related to whatever exposures there are. I know some of you folks contract with others. If you're setting up a new piece of like a new art installation, you may be contracting with others. There are issues related to like the AB5 law that was passed in California a couple of years ago, where you're responsible for insuring those independent contractors. So if you had questions like that, feel free to reach out to us and we can kind of explain how that all works. But safety training is really an important part of keeping your costs low, because as you would imagine, the more claims you have in workers' comp, the higher the premium is going to be. So keeping safety as a really strong focus for everyone, it just helps everyone. It helps people avoid being injured, and it helps you keep your costs down so you can operate your organization in the most efficient, cost-effective way. Next slide. So go ahead, Chelsea.
All right. So wanted to talk about some of the other resources that we make available to you. So I actually don't have this one on here, but I did want to touch on, Cole and I had caught up and wanted to talk a little bit about some abuse prevention services that we offer. Whether you have any youth programs that you actually run, or if you work with schools and maybe they require you to have abuse insurance as part of doing work with some local schools. It is really, really important to get some good abuse prevention practices, trainings, background checks, all of that is just so important. And we work with closely with an organization called Presidium that is an expert in abuse prevention practices. And so we have several different things that we offer in terms of helping you to prevent any abuse. So anything from like we negotiate discounted background checks on your behalf that you can utilize. We also have services like from Presidium, like building your crisis response plan in case there ever were an incident of abuse. What steps do I need to take? Do I need, what public relations type steps, what information do I need to share with my customers or clients? Those kinds of things. We have training We have a learning management system that has 20 different courses on abuse prevention, from a foundations course, mandatory reporter course, if any of your folks would be deemed a mandatory reporter. So all sorts of different resources, from hiring practices to supervising, training, all of the above. So did want to mention that. And then the ones we have here, we've talked quite a bit about third-party risk transfer. In addition to the waiver templates that I was mentioning, we do also have things like online self-assessments that you can take, not just on third-party risk transfer, but also on governance, transportation exposures, many different topics where you can go through and answer a series of primarily yes or no questions. And then afterwards, it would spit out a summary of how you answered, where you're doing really well in terms of risk management, and where you may consider employing some additional risk management practices. We have courses you can take, we have guidelines, all sorts of different things. We've done summaries on the California laws as well. So there's different things you would have access to, all housed within a risk resources portal that we offer. The second item on here is the visitor management. So we have things like Visit You, which is a visitor management software all housed on an iPad. We have C-Bond, which is where we've negotiated discounts on their glass strengthening technology. So this actually kind of ties back to some of the active assailant things that we have to be aware of and cautious of today. So there's a couple different products that you would put on your exterior facing glass windows and doors to help make them a little bit more impenetrable. They do also offer some commercial grade disinfecting products as well. So a lot of great resources to help you manage visitors, third-party risks, abuse risks, transportation risks as well. So a lot of driver courses, telematics are becoming a huge thing with commercial carriers. So a lot to look out for, more than we would have time for in just the small amount today, but there's a lot of good stuff out there. And this only covers even just kind of your general liability, auto liability risks, but there's a lot more even with cyber that Cole was mentioning, and a lot of other good things. Okay. And I think slide. We can go, yeah.
So here's our services. CNIS is just California, our Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services, but we're a full insurance broker, providing all lines of coverage, including employee benefits. We have exclusive programs for nonprofits, like dental and vision and things like that. You get a complimentary mineral subscription, which is a great online HR resource, risk management newsletter, this True subscription, which is a way for you to connect via text. And then the affinity discounts for special, just for CAM members. So these products that we're talking about today are not available in the general public. Even if you have Great American as an insurance company, you can't get these rates through anyone else except through us as a CAM member. And then the concierge level service from our support team, 24/7 access, and then access to the Nonprofit Benefits Trust, which is the employee benefits program we talked about. So basically, it's great that we have insurance products now that just don't provide the basic needs you need in insurance, but you have all these resources that are all complementary to basically help you keep and maintain a good, safe environment and to keep your costs as low as possible. So that's the wonderful thing that you all have access to, that I think many people just don't know. And I think having the time to take this webinar, I'm hoping you're getting a lot of good information from it, and that you could reach out to us if there's any questions you may have. Next slide. So this is it. This is you guys now. So any questions you may have, we're happy to address those.
Feel free to enter those in the chat or. while folks might be doing that, there was one benefit that Cole didn't highlight that I want to make sure is the importance of not just the discounts and stuff, but really having the expertise of an agent who really understands your business is just so crucial. Makes our job easier on the carrier side when we know we have an agent who really understands your business. So incredibly important, and grateful to Cole for that.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been doing this. I've been doing this for about 35 years and working in the museum space for a big portion of that time. So we know your business pretty well. And when we came up with this program and worked with Great American to set it up, we really thought about all the things we could put in there that were really of value to you. So for example, we have a special form just for events. So certain events are just included automatically without you even having to tell us. They're just included in the form and at no extra cost. We build in that active assailant coverage automatically. There's a bunch of different just incredible benefits that you may not even know are available, and we can provide the higher limits and things like that that you will need if you have certain contracts that require higher limits of insurance. To a point, there could be umbrella limits that we may need to go elsewhere for, but essentially most of the stuff that you're getting from a contract place we can address. Someone had a question about cyber liability and training. That's a really good question. So a lot of insurance companies do offer complimentary training for cyber liability. The resource that I mentioned, Mineral, also has complimentary cyber training courses in there. What's cool about that platform too is that your HR manager or whoever supervisor within your organization can assign those classes specifically to people on your team. So that's a really big benefit through using Mineral. Jen just mentioned a thing about event cancellation and COVID. It's interesting, just prior to the pandemic, it was really common to see event cancellation coverage. And what that is, it's a separate policy that you would take out for a specific event. So say you had a special event coming for a really big deal, you've been advertising it and everyone's excited about it. And then, something happened and you couldn't show the event and you were basically going to lose all this money. So event cancellation would cover things like that, but it would have certain exclusions. Well, one of the things that was not sometimes excluded prior to the pandemic was contagious diseases. That wasn't something that they anticipated would be a big deal. And after COVID, it is a big deal, obviously. So all those types of policies now have that strict exclusion related to any kind of contagious disease like COVID, unfortunately. So it's just something we're going to have to live with at this point in time, but it is unfortunate. I'm sure all of you suffered greatly during the pandemic when people couldn't be together. But I have to say, it's really nice that we can all go to your museums again and enjoy them and just be in the community, even though COVID is still kind of rearing its head often still. I mean, we have some nonprofit groups here in San Francisco that were just outbreaks last week where they had to shut down facilities. These weren't museums, but they were like Meals on Wheels and different things like that. But it's just unfortunate that we still have to live with this. But it is still in our life, and I think it will be for some time. Any other comments?
I had a question posed to me. How would you recommend a museum get started, and what insurance services would you recommend for basic needs?
Yeah, so you can get started by just contacting us. We can get you started. There's really simple applications that we can provide you. They're all online, and it's really easy to complete those and to get insurance quotes from us. The basic coverage that we want you to have would be general liability is the most common coverage. We'd also need to see any contracts you have that require certain insurance because we'd need to be able to address that. So basically, general liability would be the first. Second would be insurance for the stuff that you own or lease, including your fine arts. Directors and officers liability is also something we highly recommend just because you depend on that volunteer board and you really want to make sure that they feel secure, that they have the proper coverage to protect them. Volunteer coverage is also something we highly recommend, just because we would imagine that you would really depend on volunteers. Policies like that start at around $100 per year, so they're not too expensive. Workers' compensation would also be a mandated coverage because it's a state requirement, but it's really, again, super easy to get. Those would be the most basic coverages that I'd recommend. And then you can, the great thing is the policy form that we'd place you in would include so many extra benefits that, you know, you may want to get higher limits on certain things, but there's going to be a lot of benefits just thrown in at smaller amounts that will be really beneficial for you.
Question. So if folks are maybe not sure on if their CAM membership is valid or anything like that, I think I would just suggest that if you want to check your CAM membership and therefore check to see your Cal nonprofits kind of access or benefits, you're welcome to email us. Our administrative manager, Michelle Rader, can be reached at admin@calmuseums.org if you want to check your membership status or renew or explore it. I'll put the link to her, or I'll put her email address in the chat as well if you want to double check that.
And you can also access our program through the CAM website. There's some information in there about how to connect with us, but our contact information is at the end of this presentation as well. So we'll get back to you quickly for anyone that requests any help.
Amazing. Any other questions? Or like very specific scenarios? Awesome. Okay, it seems like we've had some good questions posed. I want to thank Chelsea and Cole for taking the time today to put on this webinar and present all these topics to us. We will wrap up our webinar here, but again, this is Cole's contact information on screen. If you want to follow up with either of them, you're also welcome to send me an email. I'm programs@calmuseums.org. I'll be following up with all registrants to send out the YouTube recording link and any other kind of documents or things that came up during the session. So thank you again. Again, keep us in mind for membership. Check us out if you want to access all those benefits. There's lots of great upcoming webinars as well for various topics coming up in the summertime if you keep an eye on our e-news. All right, thank you so much. Chelsea, Cole, any last things to add?
No, just thank you for coming.
Awesome. Yeah. Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
All right.